Hello and welcome to this, our sixth class on the book of Revelation, subtitled Apocalypse as Hope. Today, we are going to be going over the seven seals of Revelation, and I don't mean the animal. I mean as in the wax bindings on a scroll. And here are the seven seals listed out as a precursor. And actually, we'll just be going over six seals because the seventh is open at the beginning of the next chapter, which we'll be going over in the next class in 2 weeks. Note that in 2 weeks. We'll be off next week. But for now, let's look back on what we have been doing. Last week, we took a hard look at the fourth and fifth chapters of Revelation. Chapter 4, we found it included a description of the heavenly throne room. We discussed how John's vision compares to other descriptions of God's throne room from his Jewish apocalyptic traditions, such as in Isaiah and Ezekiel. Furthermore, we discussed the message conveyed by the description of God's throne room. They would have immediately, they meaning the original readers or hearers of this letter, would have immediately recognized that here was set a throne room scene that not only rivaled the emperor's, but made his look drab and unimpressive by comparison. Even the heavenly court is adorned in splendor in such a way that suggests that God's attendants reflect more of God's glory than the emperor's own accoutrements. The message, God is God, Caesar is not. Then chapter 5 begins with an introduction of a scroll, the one we'll be discussing today, and it is sealed with 7 seals as a royal might seal a document of high importance. However, the prophet John becomes appalled and dismayed that there seems to be no one worthy to open the scroll. Then enter Jesus the Christ, first as a lion, but then as a slaughtered lamb. The lamb takes the scroll, and so is proclaimed by the heavenly hosts as worthy, thus signifying that the slaughtered lamb is worthy to open the scroll. The worthiness of the lamb rivals the worthiness of God on the throne, thus elevating Jesus above the emperor. Tonight, we'll consider the messages that we are meant to receive by way of symbolic metaphor. The breaking of each seal on the scroll is accompanied by a miniature scene of its own. Tonight, we'll consider each of these and explore what they might have meant to first-century Christians in the Roman Empire. The whole while, try and see if you can find similarities to the context to the context to which John wrote and to our own. Try to find similarities between what we're reading and the implications in where we are today. And let us begin, starting with verse 1 of chapter 6, which reads, Then I saw the Lamb break one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures call out, as with the voice of thunder, Come! I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. John is commanded to come, or perhaps to go, depending on how it's translated. Either way, he is invited or commanded to enter into the next vision. This will be one of 3 visions or images that will each communicate similar points, but in different ways. Today, we are considering the scroll and its 7 seals, but coming up, we will encounter a scene with 7 trumpets and 7 bowls, 3 sets of 7. I think that Brian Blunt's summary of Revelation chapters 6 through 16 gives us a helpful lens through which we might see the larger middle portion of the letter. He writes, John is the master of a 3-ring narrative circus. The 7 seals in chapters 6 through 8:1, which we're reading today, the 7 trumpets in chapter 8, verse 2 through 11, verse 18, and the 7 bowls, chapter 16, verses 1 through 21, stage the same preparatory buildup to the Last Judgment. They do so, however, from different perspectives. Hearers and readers watch 3 different versions of the end time unfold simultaneously at 3 different places on the narrative set. In other words, what we're about to encounter in the 7 seals, the main points they're communicated are repeated when we encounter the scene with the 7 trumpets, and then repeated again when we encounter the scene of the 7 bowls. All 3 different word pictures, metaphors, meant to communicate the same thing. But let's stick with where we're at today. John is first presented with a vision of a rider on a white horse. This is no ordinary rider. This rider is a conqueror. His crown would indicate that he is a royal. The color is also significant, as will be the case with the next 3 horses and their riders. Of this passage, Brian Thompson writes, Revelation underscores white, probably reflecting the significance of white horses in the Greco-Roman world. High-ranking officers rode white horses. One can compare this scene to the entrance of Jesus as the Lamb, entering the scene on a white horse that is described in these exact same Greek words which indicate a brilliantly white horse. However, as we proceed, you will hopefully notice the important differences between these 4 riders and Jesus as he rides in chapter 19. More on this probably next month when we get to that. But for now, the most important thing to know about this horse is that it is the horse of a conquering king. And this is precisely who sits astride the horse. The king has a crown that he wears on his head, indicating that he fully owns the role of conquering king, for only a king who has conquered is meant to wear a crown. So far, so good. This scene would not be unlike any number of statues erected throughout the Roman Empire of conquering generals and emperors on their horses. This image may well have instilled national pride in some. But there is one important detail that would have caught the first century Romans off guard. This rider holds a bow. So what? Well, according to classical historians, as fearsome as Rome was as a military power, its legendary legions never mastered the use of a bow. Archers from the ranks of client kingdoms were employed as auxiliary troops. The bow was, however, a primary weapon of several of Rome's principal enemies. In fact, it stood as a metaphor for the kingdom Rome feared the most, Parthia. The Parthians were renowned not only for their archery skills, but even more impressively for their ability to fire their bows accurately while mounted on galloping white horses. So this image of a rider on a white horse wielding a bow is meant to convey a message to Rome. Just as you've seen yourself in the role of conqueror, the same kind of forces you've arrayed against your neighbors will come back around. In this scene, when the Lamb unseals the first scroll, he unleashes the same kind of conquering violence on Rome that it had inflicted on that entire region of the world, which, in the grand scheme of things, is just what happened over a long period of time. Rome's influence waned as its conquered territories were reclaimed. I have Jesus' warning to Peter in mind here. Those that live by the sword will die by the sword. Moving on, verses 3 and 4. When he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another, and he was given a great sword. Emphasis on bright red. The bright red horse indicates victory in warfare. This is the color of slaughter, which would cue us into the meaning of this second horse and its rider. And this rider who brings slaughter brings calamity and destruction to the entire world by using a great sword. This great sword was, quoting, used for swinging and cutting rather than for stabbing. It was a symbol of imperial authority, in particular, the emperor's authority to decree the death penalty, which was called the right of the sword, writes Brian Blunt. The sword here is key. This cues the readers or the hearers of this letter that the so-called peace of Rome, or Pax Romana, is built on a lie. Rome was peaceful for some of its citizens, but the great sword Rome wielded kept the peace by violent oppression. 'Peace through strength,' as some have said. But now the truth is told of the great sword. It does not provide peace, but global calamity. And boy, don't we see this truth play out again and again and again, even today. Later, John declares that those who kill with the sword shall likewise themselves be killed by the sword. That's in chapter 13. So that prophecy is coming. The second writer uses his weapon to set that tragic circumstance into motion. The Romans, who used the sword to create their self-interested peace, now find the sword being used to cut them down and shred their serenity to bits. The irony is eschatologically delicious. They not only receive the justice they deserve, their own symbolic tool of pitiless oppression is used to deliver it. Which historically is what eventually happened to Rome in piecemeal fashion. But the same factors remain. If what pertains to Rome is true of us all, if the great sword will find its way back around to wound its wielder, then all nation states that have risen to power by way of comparable military force may face a similar end, which is, for us, a sobering thought. Going on to the third seal, verses 5 through 6. When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out, "Come!" I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in its hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, but do not damage the olive oil and the wine." Owen writes, the black horse and rider represent famine. Pair of scales, a tool used by merchants to weigh their products, and is also used as a symbol for justice. Now, the white horse symbolized the collapse of conquering empires. The red horse symbolized the blood-red slaughter that the collapses of empires inevitably will entail. The next logical step is famine and food shortage, as these nearly inevitably come in the wake of war. As was mentioned above, scales can symbolize divine judgment, as I believe they do in part here. But their primary purpose in this passage is to indicate that this horseman has something more to teach us about unjust economies, ones that benefit the comfortable while others are suffering under the economic system. In verse 6, we read that with all of its talk about what grains cost, we should not damage the olive oil and the wine. What's this about? Well, those Romans living during that time of this letter's writing would have had little trouble filling in the blanks. These are not good prices. This describes a financial situation in which one is barely able to keep their family afloat, if they can even do so at all. In other words, it's about inflation and what happens to the costs of food and other things that people need in times of violence and calamity. And so this seal represents the coming of that kind of existence. If John's accounting is correct, writes Brian Blunt, a person's entire daily wage was committed solely to food. Owen sets the inflationary rate as 8 times the normal price for wheat and 5.5 times the normal value for barley. We're talking starvation wages here, but not everyone is suffering. Verse 6 tells us of a voice coming from the throne room amidst the 4 living creatures we considered 2 weeks ago. This voice instructs the writer not to damage the olive oil or the wine. What gives here? Well, some historical context is in order. There was a great famine during the reign of Domitian, during the year Common Era 92. This famine likely occurred just before Revelation's writing, if not during. Of this, Dr. Brian Blunt writes, wealthy Roman landowners had determined that if they devoted their lands to oil and wine rather than grain, they could build greater profits. The end result, particularly during a food shortage, was devastating. While oil and wine continued to flow in abundant quantities, wheat and barley became frighteningly scarce. To ameliorate the effects of this catastrophe and ameliorate the possibility of future ones, Domitian ordered that all the vineyards, particularly those in Asia Minor, be cut back in half. In this case, the voice of God would speak with this recent imperial action in mind. And we might have in mind here the Irish potato famine. I don't know how well familiar you are with it, but we call it a famine, but it was in fact a starvation that was forced upon the people by ways of the imperial decrees of the British Empire. The British Empire kept beef specifically and other goods flowing off of the island of Ireland whilst the blight had impacted the potato harvests. And so whilst people were starving, the price of beef had so risen and become so popular as a commodity on the island that there was still plenty of food. However, it was priced out of what the Irish commoners could afford, and so it was whisked off island. So you have a similar sort of dynamic here with wheat and barley being priced out and them trying to recoup their costs by through the sales of olive oil and wine. Moving on to the breaking of the fourth seal, verses 7 and 8. When he broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature call out, "Come." I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. Here comes one, the color of death. For in the Roman world, pale green was associated with sickness, death, and dying. This horse will be the worst yet. His rider's very name is Death, which is humanity's worst enemy. He's followed by the Greek god Hades, and here he means to connect the personification of death with the equally fearful personification of Hades, so that his readers may be assured that the peril now confronting them in the narrative is total. So, to keep the record straight, we've got a symbol for conquering empires being conquered themselves, white horse, a symbol for war-making, violent peoples having their violence turned back on them, that's the red horse, to a symbol of the corresponding famines that come on the wake of such war-making, that's the black horse, and now we arrive at the inevitable end of humanity's sins should they go unchecked, our deaths. Humans will conquer, creating new enemies. We will maintain a false peace made possible by violent interventions. And as humanity struggles through the intermittent famines that result from humanity's actions, some of us continue to feast on the finer things of life while others starve. The result of all of this is death. Death for those killed, death for the killers, death for the poor, and ultimately death for the rich alike. And in an age of nuclear bombs and the ruination of our planet Earth, our fear of this pale green horse should be very acute. I'm speaking metaphorically here in regards to the horse and its rider, which is now, I believe, how readers are meant to take him. But the death he represents is facing our human race in new ways that echo the old. Moving on to the fifth seal, verses 9 through 11. When he broke the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, "Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth?" They were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number would be complete, both of their fellow servants and of their brothers and sisters who were soon to be killed as they themselves had been killed. These verses are all about how to reconcile the suffering of the innocent with a loving and just God. The calamity of the four horsemen that they bring is indiscriminate, and it impacts the rich and the poor, the high and the low. Those who faithfully witnessed to the loving ways of Jesus and refused to accept the death-dealing ways of empire often found themselves at the wrong end of Rome's great sword. And the famines orchestrated by their rulers had an undue impact on the vulnerable. And so, what of those who are so put under? That's what this is about. A few more notes before we move on. First, on the word soul, used here to describe those who are under the altar. It says that it's the souls of those who had been slaughtered. The soul is simply the force that animates them, and that's what is left. In the Israelite temple, there were two altars. One for sacrifices and the other in the inner sanctum, or the Holy of Holies. The altar pictured in this scene is more akin to the sacrificial altar, where in Leviticus 4, verse 7, we read that the blood of the sacrificial bulls was placed at the base of this altar. Now, the souls of the saints, poured out as blood when they were executed for their faithfulness, cries out for justice. It is as much to say, will our deaths be in vain? Did we die for nothing? Their passionate cry of how long reminded the early Christians of the line of prophets who had also cried out to God, how long? And they cried it in their day, and we still cry this in our day. In answer to their pleas for justice, they are given a white robe and told to rest a bit longer until, quote, the number would be complete. This is, in fact, a bad translation. Here we find one of those moments where John's Greek presents translation issues. Remember back in one of the first classes, we mentioned how he has the strangest Greek, writes in the strangest Greek of really anyone that we know. It's very unique and idiosyncratic to him. And here's one of those moments where his Greek becomes somewhat troubling. The Greek equivalent of the English word number is not found in this verse. A more literal translation would read, first the brothers and sisters must be fulfilled. What seems to be indicated here is that while the time is not yet arrived and there will still be suffering for the cause, the suffering has boundaries. It will not go on forever. God will end it. In the meantime, the saints who have died are given brilliant white robes, festive garments of joy, freedom, and even royal status. This scene is meant to encourage Christians still living to be willing to face suffering if it's the right thing for us to do, while knowing that even should we face the worst, God sees that we experience the rewards of our suffering in the end. Now the sixth seal, verses 12 through 14, and they read, when he broke the sixth seal, I looked, and there was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll rolling itself up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. Verses 12 through 14 use stock apocalyptic language. If these words sound familiar, they should. Jesus used the same words to describe the transition between the old order of things and God's coming realm. You can read similar sayings in Matthew 24 coming from the mouth of Jesus. In this vision of John's, the suffering and evil baked into human existence is so entrenched that its final eradication will be a raucous and violent affair. No one really knows how the world will end, but this vision is meant to convey the intensity of that moment. When God will end evil, it will be a top-down affair. No stone left unturned. And here I should want to correct myself. When I say no one really knows how the world will end, I should really have said no one really knows how this transition will occur. And that's what's being described here, a transition from an old order to a new order, not an end. But anyway, when that happens, no stone will be left unturned. From the cosmos, the very depths of the earth even, God will restore and bring justice to them. Even as the world collapses as a result of humanity's violence and greed, God will not let these destructive forces win the day. Here again is the point of the martyrs and their white robes that we just read about. Even should these destructive forces take our lives, we keep our souls. Living saints are meant to take heart at this. Moving on, verses 15 through 17. When the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free. Sorry, let me take another pass at that. Verse 15. Then the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the rocks and mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of the one on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now here, wrath and the pictures of wrath are the judgments for the evil done by, in this case, the Roman Empire and those that partnered with them. And the judgments are at once judgments and the consequence. It's as if they pull the sky down on their own heads by way of their actions. And here we see all manner of humans of every class, the rich and the poor, the slave and the free alike, and they are fleeing God's judgment. And why shouldn't they? But now those who had deceived themselves into thinking they could maintain their positions by way of their influence, power, and wealth had discovered that God's justice is truly equitable. There is no two-tiered justice system from God's vantage point. We will all, in one way or another, face the music. Some final thoughts. John wrote a letter to first-century Christians throughout the eastern parts of the Roman Empire to help them not only better understand the times in which they lived, but to give them hope amidst the seemingly meaningless violence and suffering that surrounded them. We too should read this book through a similar lens. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they are called, represent forces still unleashed on our world today. Conquering leaders cause great suffering and are then conquered in turn. Violence permeates the lives of God's children across the globe. Famine and hunger are on the rise globally, most of which has been caused by human action. White horse, red horse, black horse, green horse? I hope not. This point will be made still clearer in a later lesson, but one of the primary reasons John wrote his letter was to warn complacent Christians away from these ways. We may not need to see much of the green horse or his riders as we have of late. If humans repent of death-dealing ways and turn to the life-giving ways of God, then much death and suffering will be averted. The green horse kept at bay, and maybe the other horses too. John saw that there were many Christians in the Roman Empire who saw nothing wrong with the order of things, as they had been provided with a comfortable life. John wants them to sit uneasy in their comfort so that they too will resist the forces that cause human suffering around us. I think that John may have me in mind. I am afraid. But after the opening of the fifth seal, we are assured that even while we wait, even should we lose our physical lives for living faithfully in hard times, we will not have died in vain. God sees us in our suffering, knows our motives, and will ensure that our efforts will not have been in vain. Our white robe may be waiting. In the meantime, don't give up. What happened after the sixth seal was opened should serve as a warning to the powerful who believe they will be able to insulate themselves from the suffering of humanity. The wealthiest people on the planet have been known to build hidden island fortresses and bunkers with a mind to wait out the end of the world in safety. The final verses of chapter 6 are meant to dispel them of that notion. Justice and just rewards will find us all, no matter our station in life. And this concludes our lesson. If you have any questions, please write into me. My email is Heath, that's my name, Heath, at indyncc.org. That's Heath at indyncc.org. And I'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, here are some books that you might read that I would recommend. And here is the exhaustive list of my sources, primary and commentaries. A few more here listed. And our next class will be in 2 weeks' time on June the 30th. That's a Tuesday, 6:30. There will also be a video released, so you may enjoy it that way as well. And we hope to see you next time.